In the spring of 1879, in the high grass country east of Helena, in the Montana Territory, a girl of 18 stood at the gate of a dead man's stable and counted out everything she owned. It came to $4 and a folding knife, a comb with 2 teeth gone, and a saddle blanket her grandmother had woven before her hands had stopped working. The stable was hers now, by a clerk's careless signature and a debt no one else would touch, and the men who had handled the paperwork had laughed at her on the courthouse steps. They told her she had bought a ruin. They told her the roof was gone in 3 places, and the well was fouled, and the lawman who built it had been dead 2 winters, and his ghost could keep her company. What none of them knew, what the girl herself did not yet know, was that the smallest room in that ruin had been locked from the inside, and that what waited behind its door would settle a wrong older than she was. Her name was Pearl Hatch, and she had been put out of her father's house on the morning of her 18th birthday, which is a thing that still happened in that country to a daughter who would not marry where she was told. There had been a man chosen for her, a freighter twice her age, with a temper that showed in his hands, and Pearl had said no in front of the whole supper table, plainly and only once. Her father had not struck her. He had simply set her bag on the porch and told her the door would not open again, and Pearl had walked off the only land she had ever known, with the morning still gray around her. She did not weep where anyone could see. She had learned long ago that tears were a coin spent for nothing, and she had none to waste. You may already know how it feels to be told you are worth less than the dirt under a stranger's boots. If you do, stay with this one, because Pearl did not stay down, and the way she rose is worth the telling. What Pearl had that her father did not reckon on was a trade. From the age of 9 she had spent her summers in the shop of her grandmother's brother, an old saddler named Asa Crane, who worked leather in a lean-to behind the livery in the town where Pearl was born. Asa was a quiet man with a milky eye and hands like cured oak, and he had taught Pearl the whole craft without ever once saying he was teaching her. He showed her how to read a hide before the knife touched it, how to feel the grain run beneath her thumb, how a stitch laid wrong would let go in a year, and a stitch laid right would outlast the horse. He taught her the awl and the edger and the round knife, and he taught her that leather remembered everything done to it, every wetting and every strain, and that a patient hand could read a piece of harness like a page of a book. Asa had died when Pearl was 16, and he had left her his tools in a wooden box with a sliding lid, and those tools were the one thing her father had not dared to take, because the box had her name burned into the underside in Asa's own careful letters. So when the stable came up for the back taxes owed on it, and the price was $4 because no one in the county wanted a dead lawman's ruin 2 miles from the nearest road, Pearl laid down her $4 and signed her name. The courthouse was a single low room that smelled of tobacco and floor wax, and the tax sale was conducted by a clerk with ink on his cuffs who plainly wished to be elsewhere. He read the parcel description in a flat hurry, the stable and its half-section of grass sold as it stood, no warranty of title past the county's own, and he asked twice whether the girl understood that the money would not be returned. She had said she understood. He asked whether she had someone advising her, a father or a husband or a man of business, and Pearl said that she did not and did not need one, and the clerk shrugged and wrote her name where she pointed because the law did not forbid a woman of age from throwing her money away. The men along the wall had grinned at one another, and one of them, a stock dealer named Foley with a gold tooth and a habit of speaking to women as though they were slow, had said that the girl had just bought herself a great deal of fresh air. He said it loud enough for the room, and the room obliged him with the kind of laughter men give a joke they would not have made themselves. Foley went on to say that he would offer her $3 for it that very afternoon, a dollar's loss being cheap schooling, and that she should take it before the snow taught her the lesson harder. Pearl looked at him then, levelly the way she had looked at the freighter across her father's supper table, and she said that she would keep what she had bought. She folded her receipt into her grandmother's saddle blanket and walked out without giving Foley the satisfaction of another word. And behind her, the laughter went a little thin, the way laughter does when its object refuses to be small. The lawman who had built the stable was named Eli Thorne, and the country remembered him the way it remembered a hard winter, with respect and a certain relief that it was over. He had been a deputy marshal for the better part of 20 years, a tall, stooped man who rode alone and said little, and he had built his place far out on the grass because he did not care for the company of the town. He kept horses there, good ones, and it was said he could gentle an animal no one else could put a hand on. Then one autumn he had gone out after a man who had robbed the stage line and had come back across his own saddle, and the country had buried him and moved on. His horses were sold off to pay what he owed. His house fell in on itself. And the stable, stone-founded and stubborn, simply stood there emptying of meaning year by year, until a girl with $4 made it her own. Pearl reached the place on foot in the late afternoon, and she stood at the gate a long while before she went in, because a thing you have bought sight unseen deserves to be looked at, honestly, before you let yourself hope. The roof was gone over the hayloft, just as they had said. The well cover had rotted through, and the water below smelled of iron and old leaves. The walls, though, were sound. The walls were laid stone, 2 feet thick, at the base set by a man who built as though he meant to argue with time, and Pearl put her hand flat against them and felt how cool and certain they were, and something in her chest that had been clenched since her father's porch let go a single notch. She slept that first night in the one dry corner of the main aisle, wrapped in the saddle blanket, with Asa's toolbox for a pillow. She did not sleep much. The wind came down off the mountains and worked at the broken roof, and somewhere in the dark an owl went about its business, and Pearl lay awake doing sums. $4 gone, a folding knife, a comb, the tools. A roof to mend before the snow, and no money to mend it, and no one within 2 miles to ask. She listened to the stable around her, the way a person listens to a strange house, and slowly the sounds sorted themselves into the ordinary, the settling of old timber, the scurry of a mouse in the fallen hay, the long sigh of the wind finding the gaps in the stone. None of it was a ghost. She had half expected to mind the dead man's presence, and found instead that the place felt only abandoned, not haunted, a thing left rather than a thing lingered in. And there was a kind of company in that for a girl who had been left herself. By any honest reckoning she should have been afraid, and some part of her was. Fear, though she had decided long ago, was a horse you could either let run or take by the head, and Pearl took it by the head and turned its face toward the morning. It was on the second day, while she was clearing the fallen timber from the back of the stable, that she found the room. It sat at the far end of the aisle, a small square room walled off in the same heavy stone, and she had taken it at first for a feed store. The door was oak, banded with iron, and it did not give when she pushed it. She put her shoulder to it, and it did not give. She found, when she brushed the dust away, that there was no keyhole on her side. The lock was on the inside. The door had been bolted from within, and then, somehow, the one who bolted it had gone, and the room had held its breath for 2 years while the rest of the place came down around it. A locked room with a lock on the wrong side is a question that will not let a person sleep, and Pearl did not try to make it. She studied the door the way Asa had taught her to study a hide, slowly and from every angle, looking for what the thing itself would tell her. The hinges were on her side, set in the stone with lead. That was the way in, if there was a way in, and Pearl had her grandfather's box of tools, and a great deal of time, and no one to tell her she could not. What I want you to hold on to as she set the first chisel against the first hinge pin is that nothing in this story was given to her. Everything she got, she took out of iron and oak with her own 2 hands. Remember that when you reach the end, the hinges were the work of 3 days. The lead had been poured hot around the pins and had set like a grudge, and Pearl had no proper drift to drive them, so she made one from a length of broken harness bolt, filing it true against the stone until it would seat in the pinhead. The first morning she spent only in study, walking the length of the iron strap, scraping the rust from the knuckles with the back of her knife, to see how the thing was made. Asa had taught her that a tool, like a hide, would tell you how to use it if you looked long enough before you forced it, and a hinge was only a tool for holding a door, and a door was only a hide of oak banded with iron, and everything that is made can be unmade by a hand patient enough to reverse the making. She found that the pins had been set with their heads down, against any thief who would drive them up, and so she would have to drive them down into the stone, which meant cutting a relief at the foot of each knuckle deep enough to take the pin's travel. She worked from a ladder of stacked timber, lashed at the joints with strips of green rawhide so it would not shift under her, and her arms learned a new kind of tired, the kind that goes past the muscle and into the joint, and at night she wrapped her hands in strips torn from her undershift, because the blisters had opened and would not close. She kept a tin of Asa's tallow and beeswax salve, and worked it into her palms each evening by the stove, and still the skin split. On the first day she freed nothing. She drove the made drift against the top pin 200 strokes, by her own count, and the pin did not move the width of a hair, and she climbed down at dark, and ate cold beans from the can, and lay awake, listening to the room behind the wall keep its silence. On the second day she changed her angle, set the drift a half-turn off true so the force would crack the lead before it moved the iron, and near noon she heard a sound come up through the handle of her maul, a small dry report like a green stick breaking, and she knew the lead had let go even before the pin rose. The top pin rose an inch and stuck, and she wept, then briefly, from pure exhaustion alone where no one could see, and then she wiped her face and went back up the ladder. By dark of the second day she had it standing 2 inches proud of the knuckle, and could turn it with her fingers, and she did not sleep that night, either for a different reason. On the third day, near dusk, the top pin came free in her hand, warm from the friction, heavy as a secret, and she held it a moment before she set it down. It was a hand-forged pin as long as her forearm, square at the head where a hammer had shaped it, and she understood looking at it that Eli Thorne had made it himself, or stood over the man who did, because no merchant hinge ever carried iron like that. She set it on the bench she would later build, and turned to the lower knuckle in the last of the light. The bottom pin came easier, the lead having cracked along a flaw, and when both were out, Pearl pried the door from its frame on the hinge side, and it swung loose and heavy, and groaned out of the stone. A breath of air came out of the room to meet her. It was cold air, cold in a way the spring evening was not, the held cold of a place sealed against 2 years of weather, and it carried a smell she knew better than her own name. It was the smell of leather, and neatsfoot oil, and old wax, the smell of Asa's lean-to, and Pearl stood in the doorway with the pin still in her hand and did not understand for a moment how the dead man's stable could smell of her own dead teacher's trade. Then she lit her lantern and held it up, and the room gave back what it had been keeping. It was a tack room, and it was the finest she had ever seen. The walls were hung with harness and saddlery from floor to ceiling, every piece oiled and sound, racks of bridles and breast collars, and a dozen saddles on their trees, and all of it the work of a master. Pearl moved among it slowly, touching nothing, at first only looking, and what she saw made the breath go thin in her. The stitching was beyond anything in the county. The tooling on the saddle skirts was a pattern she had seen exactly twice before in her life. A running vine with a particular 5-petaled flower worked into the turns, and she had seen it on the only 2 pieces Asa Crane had ever kept for himself and would not sell at any price. She knelt before the nearest saddle and turned up the fender and found burned into the underside of the leather in careful letters the maker's mark. It was a crane standing on one leg inside a circle. It was Asa's mark. It was on every piece in the room, For a long while Pearl could not move. The lantern threw her shadow tall against the oiled leather, and the cold air settled around her, and she understood that she was standing inside 30 years of a man's work she had thought lost, or sold, or never made at all. Asa had spoken sometimes of a great commission from his younger days, a full outfitting for a wealthy buyer who had paid in advance and then vanished before the goods were delivered. And Asa had kept the pieces all his life because he could not bear to break up a thing made whole, and could not find another buyer who would take it entire. He had never said what became of it. Pearl had assumed it was a sad old man's story, the kind that grows in the telling. Here it was, though, racked and oiled and waiting, in the locked room of a dead lawman 2 days' walk from where Asa had worked, and Pearl knelt among it and could not yet see the line that connected the two men. She only knew the line was there. Leather does not lie, and the mark does not lie, and a thing made by one hand and locked away by another is a sentence with its middle torn out. It took her the better part of a week to understand it, and the understanding came not from the saddles, but from a flat tin document case she found on a shelf above the door, the kind a man carries papers in. The case itself had been wiped and oiled and set where damp could not reach it, which told Pearl before she opened it that whatever was inside had mattered to the man who left it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, folded in the particular way Asa had always folded oilcloth, corners tucked and the seam laid down, were 3 things. There was a bill of sale, written in a fine clerk's hand, for a complete outfitting of saddlery, 31 pieces made by A. Crane, saddler, and paid in full by a sum that made Pearl sit down on the cold floor. There was a letter, and there was a small leather pouch, soft with age, that held a child's christening spoon and a lock of pale hair tied with thread. Pearl had counted the pieces herself by then, going room round with the lantern, and she had made it 31, and seeing the number on the bill in a stranger's hand was like hearing her own thought spoken aloud by someone in the dark. She set the bill aside with great care. She held the pouch a long moment without opening it, because some part of her already knew, the way the body knows a stair is there before the foot finds it, that the lock of pale hair would be the kind of thing a person keeps only of someone they have lost. The letter was from Asa, and it was addressed to no one. The way a man writes when he is setting down a thing he cannot say aloud. Pearl read it by lantern light with her back against the stone, and she read it 3 times before the meaning would hold still. The hand was Asa's, smaller and shakier than she remembered it, the hand of his last years, and she could hear his voice in the plainness of the words, the same voice that had told her a stitch laid wrong would let go in a year. He had not written it to be found by a stranger. He had written it, she understood by the end, to her, to the child he had helped hide, against the day she would be old enough and stubborn enough to open the room and need to know why. The buyer of the Great Commission had been a man named Harlan Vane, who in those years had been building a freighting and stock empire across 3 territories, and who had ordered the outfitting as a wedding gift for a daughter. The daughter had married against Vane's wishes, married a horsebreaker with no land and no name, and Vane, in his anger, had refused to deliver the gift he had already paid for, and more than that, he had set out to ruin the man his daughter loved. He had done it the way such men do it, not with a gun, but with paper, with notes called in and credit poisoned, and a false claim of stolen stock laid against the young husband in a county where Vane owned the judge. The young man had been driven off his lease, and the young woman had died of a fever in a rented room the winter after, and the child, a daughter, not yet a year old, had been taken in by the only man who would stand against Harlan Vane in open court and lose everything for it. That man was the deputy marshal who had testified that the stolen stock claim was a forgery, and who had been broken in his career for saying so, and who had carried the orphaned child 2 days east to a saddler he trusted and asked him to keep the truth safe until the child was grown. The saddler was Asa Crane, The marshal was Eli Thorne, and the christening spoon in the pouch was wrapped in a paper that gave the child's name, and the name was Pearl. She had not known any of it. She had been raised by the man she called her father, who had taken her in as an infant and never told her she was not his by blood, and who had put her out at 18 for refusing a marriage, never knowing or never caring that he was repeating, in a smaller key, the very cruelty that had orphaned her. Pearl Hatch was not Pearl Hatch. She was the daughter of the horsebreaker Harlan Vane had destroyed, and the saddlery Asa had made for her mother's wedding had been hidden by Eli Thorne in the strongest room he owned, locked from the inside through a clever arrangement of the bolt that Pearl would later work out so that no creditor and no agent of Vane's could ever seize it. Waiting for the day the child came of age and came to claim it. You will want to know what Pearl did with that. So did I, the first time I followed this ledger to its end. The answer is the truest thing in the whole account, and it is not what the men on the courthouse steps would have done. She did not go to the law, because the law in that country had belonged to Harlan Vane and the men he left behind him, and a forged claim, 2 decades cold, would not be reopened on the word of an exiled girl. She did not go after Vane himself, because Vane himself was past her reach. He had died wealthy and untroubled some years before, in a fine house in the territory's capital, and his empire had passed to a board of partners and grandsons who knew nothing of a saddler's locked room, and would have laughed as readily as Foley had. There was no villain left to confront. There was only the truth, made of leather and paper, and the question of what truth is for. Pearl decided it was for restoring what had been broken, one piece at a time. And she began with the thing nearest to hand. She made the stable into a saddlery. It was the obvious use and the right one, and she did it with the patience Asa had drilled into her, mending the roof. First, with timber she split herself and shakes. She rived by hand over the course of a long summer, sleeping under canvas until the dry corner became a dry room. The roof work nearly beat her. She had never set a rafter in her life, and the first pair she raised came down in a wind before she had them braced, and she stood in the wreck of them and said a word her grandmother would not have liked, and then began again, having learned from the failure how the bracing wanted to go. She rived the shakes from a fallen cedar with a froe she traded a mended bridle for, splitting the bolts down their grain the way she split nothing else in her life, with such satisfaction, because cedar that wants to split is the most willing wood there is, and after a season of stubborn iron and stubborn oak, the willingness of it nearly made her laugh. She cleaned the well by hauling out the rotted cover and the fallen leaves bucket by bucket, until the water ran clear again, and she found it ran cold and sweet, the way a good well does when it is only neglected and not poisoned, and she drank from it cupped in her own raw hands and called it the first wage the place had paid her. She set Asa's tools out on a bench she built from the stable's own fallen beams, planing the beams true and pegging them without a single nail, and she hung her own first work beside the master's, and at first the contrast shamed her, and within a year it did not, because she had spent that year doing nothing but the work, and the work answered. She made cinches and latigos and mended harness, brought to her by the few who would trust a girl with their gear, and each piece taught her the next, and her stitches drew even, and her edges burnished smooth, and the running vine she had only ever seen on Asa's 2 kept pieces began slowly to come true under her own hand. The country found out about her slowly. A rancher came by needing a cinch mended, and went away with a cinch better than the one he had broken, and he told another man, and within a season there was a path worn to her gate that had not been there before. They came for the mending at first, and then they came for the making, because there was no saddler within 40 miles who could lay a stitch like the girl out at Thorne's old place, and the men who had laughed on the courthouse steps grew quiet about it, in the way a country grows quiet about a thing it was wrong about, which is to say, without ever quite admitting it, the 31 pieces of the Great Commission she did not sell. She could have A complete master outfitting of that age and quality would have brought a sum that would have set her up in town with a proper shop and a hired hand and a soft bed, and there were dealers who heard the rumor of it and rode out to make her offers, Foley among them. His gold tooth dimmer than she remembered, and his manner much improved. Now that she had something he wanted, she told them all the same thing, plainly and only once, the way she had told her father. No, the pieces were not for sale. They were her mother's wedding, and a man had died poor for keeping them safe, and they would stay whole in the room built to hold them. There was one piece she did give away, and the giving of it is the part of this story the country told longest. In the document case beneath the letter, there had been a second sheet in Ace's hand, a list of names, the people who had stood with a horsebreaker and lost for it and never been made whole. Most were dead. The list named, though a granddaughter of one of them, a woman near Pearl's own age living hard on a played-out claim south of the river, the last of a family Harlan Vane had broken on his way up. Her name was Della, and she had a child and no husband and a horse, going lame for want of a decent collar she could not afford. Pearl rode 2 days to find her on a borrowed horse, with the breast collar wrapped in clean sacking behind her saddle, and the played-out claim when she reached it was a hard sight, a soddy with a sagging ridgepole and a garden gone mostly to weeds and a single milk cow standing hip-shot in a pen of crooked rails. Della came to the door with the child on her hip and suspicion in her face, because a stranger riding 2 days out of her way is rarely good news to people who have had mostly the other kind. Pearl did not waste her time with it. She took down the sacking and unwrapped the breast collar there in the dooryard, the running vine and the 5-petaled flower catching the low light, the brass fittings gone soft gold with age, fit for a horse far finer than Della's lame one, and she held it out across the rails. She gave it without a speech. She said only that it had been made for a wedding that a hard man had spoiled, and that she thought it had waited long enough to be of use to someone he had wronged. She named Harlan Vane once, plainly, and watched the name land in Della's face, watched the older woman's grandmother and mother move behind her eyes, the whole broken line of them, and she said nothing further about it because the collar said it better than she could. Della did not understand all of it, not then. She took the collar all the same, and she wept the way Pearl had not let herself weep on her father's porch, holding the child and the leather both against her. And the two women sat a long while on the steps of the played-out claim and said very little, which was enough. When Pearl rode out the next morning, the lame horse wore the collar, and it would not cure the lameness, both of them knew that, but a horse carrying the best harness in 40 miles is a different animal to its owner's eye, and that was a kind of medicine too. That was the restitution, and it was the only kind Pearl ever cared to make, not the punishment of dead men, not the clearing of a name in a court that would not hear it, only the slow returning of made things to the hands they had been kept from, and the building of something sound out of a place everyone else had given up for a ruin. The bolt that had locked the room from the inside, Pearl worked out at last on a winter evening, turning the freed mechanism over in her hands by the stove. She had carried it out of the room the day she opened it and set it aside, too taken with the saddlery to study it, and it was only when the snow shut her indoors that she gave it the attention it deserved. Eli Thorne had set a long iron bar to drop into a stone socket when the door was pulled to from without, tripped by a pin and a length of cord run through a hole no bigger than a straw, so that a man could close the door from the aisle and the room would lock itself behind a bolt no one outside could reach. The cord had long since rotted away, which was why the bar had stayed dropped, sealing the room past the reach of any key. She traced the whole clever cruelty of it with a fingertip, the bevel filed on the bar so it would slide and then catch, the socket cut square into living stone, and she saw that the thing could be opened only one way, by taking the door off its hinges, the very labor she had spent 3 days at without knowing it was the single lock the maker had left her. It was the work of a careful, frightened, honorable man, and Pearl understood, holding it. exactly what it had cost him. He had built a lock that could only be opened by someone willing to take the whole door apart, which is to say by someone with a trade in her hands and a reason that would not let her quit. He had built it for her, though he had never seen her past her first year of life. He had trusted that the child would grow into the woman the room required. She kept the bolt on the bench where she could see it. Visitors took it for a curiosity, a bit of clever ironwork, and Pearl let them think so. She did not explain it. Some things a person earns the right to keep quiet about. The years went on as years do, and they were good to her in the plain way that good years are, which is by being mostly uneventful. The saddlery prospered. Pearl took an apprentice in time, a thin, watchful boy named Tom from a family that could not feed him, and she taught him the way Asa had taught her, without ever saying she was teaching, showing him how to read a hide before the knife touched it, and how leather remembers everything done to it. He was clumsy for the first year, and she did not scold him for it because Asa had never scolded her, and in the second year, his hands quieted and his stitches drew even. And she saw in him the thing she had not been able to see in herself at his age, which was that the work was taking. She fed him at her own table and gave him Asa's second-best round knife when his apprenticeship was out, and he received it with a care that told her it had taken in him for good. She married, eventually, a widower with a quiet way and a good seat on a horse. And if that is a romance, it is a small and late one, and beside the point of this story, which was never about a man. She bore children of her own and raised them on the grass east of Helena, within the sound of her own hammer, and she told them, when they were old enough, whose daughter she truly was, so that the name Harlan Vane tried to erase would not die out after all. Della's family and Pearl's stayed close across 2 generations. The breast collar with the running vine hung in Della's house for 40 years, and then in her granddaughter's, and the story went with it, growing a little in the telling the way such stories do, until in some versions the locked room held gold and in others it held a murdered man, when all it had ever held was leather and the truth. The truth was enough. It is almost always enough, if a person has the patience to take the door apart and the hands to do it. Asa Crane's mark, the crane on one leg inside a circle, Pearl took for her own. She burned it into every piece she made for the rest of her working life. The apprentice burned it after her, and his apprentices after him, so that for the better part of a century there was good saddlery moving through that country carrying the mark of a milky-eyed old man who had kept a wedding whole through 20 years of patience because he could not bear to break a made thing. Most who bought it never knew the name behind the mark. They only knew the work was sound, that the stitches held, that a crane-mark cinch would outlast the horse. Pearl lived to be an old woman, and near the end of her life, when her own hands had gone the way of Asa's, and could no longer hold the round knife steady, she would sit in the doorway of the stone stable in the long evenings and look at the room at the far end of the aisle. The door hung true on hinges. She had reset herself, and the room behind it was warm and full and used. A working tack room now, the Great Commission still racked along the walls where it had waited for her, oiled twice a year by hands she had trained. The cold that had met her the first evening was long gone out of it. It was the warmest room she owned. She kept Asa's toolbox on the bench beneath the window, the box with her name burned into the underside in his careful letters, and on the evening she is best remembered by, the evening her granddaughter sat down for the family to keep, she was found sitting beside it with her hand resting on the sliding lid, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they have loved a long time. She had not been afraid, the granddaughter said. She had taken fear by the head at 18 and turned its face toward the morning, and she had never once let it run. The stable stands yet, they say, walls still 2 feet thick at the base, still arguing with time and winning. And if you should ever find yourself in the high grass east of Helena, and come upon a stone building far from any road, with a small square room at the back of it, go and put your hand against the wall the way Pearl did. It is cool and certain, and it will hold. The things the world throws away are not always ruins. Sometimes they are only waiting for the right hand and the patience to take the door apart. What would you have done, do you think, if you had opened that door and found your whole stolen history racked and oiled along the walls? Would you have sold it or kept it whole? Sit with that a while. And if a story of a thing the world dismissed, turning out to hold the truth that vindicated it, is the kind of story you keep coming back for, there is another one waiting, of a woman and a riverboat, and what the high water finally gave back.